doing all it can to address the challenges facing the city of Chicago, of course, and the state of Illinois. Today's hearing is going to focus on how to address an urgent challenge facing this city, communities across the country: gun crime and violence that threatens our neighborhood and families. Gun violence is a nationwide epidemic. Today, we focus on Chicago and Illinois, but at least 12 major cities have set homicide records in the year 2021. Why? Fewer cops on the street, reduced after-school programs, court systems pushed to the limit, and mental health issues exacerbated by COVID-19. Which cities am I talking about? Well, Philadelphia is pretty obvious, a city about comparable to Chicago, but it goes way beyond that. The new homicide records have been set in St. Paul, Minnesota. If you think you can go to the Sun Belt and escape them, sorry. Tucson, Arizona, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Louisville, Kentucky. Well, I'm going to move to Indiana. That ought to be safe. Indianapolis set a new homicide record. I mentioned Columbus, Ohio. Well, let's go down to a good red state with some tough people on when it comes to law and order. Austin, Texas set a new homicide record, the capital of the state of Texas. Baton Rouge, Portland, Oregon, Toledo, the list goes on and on. Cities and states, red and blue. In the Midwest, in the West, East, North, and South. Oh, it must be the new president. That's what it's all about. That's the problem. Sorry, the homicide rate increased 20% in the last year of the Trump administration. And arrests are down nationwide. Arrests, there were 10 million in 2019, 7.6 million in the last year of the Trump administration, a 20% decline. We have problems with people who are just basically fed up with being afraid. You hear from them every day, don't you? Your neighbors and friends are talking about it. Did you hear the latest about crime in the city of Chicago? We have fewer cops because of retirement and COVID. This morning's Chicago Tribune has a front page story about what's going on Michigan Avenue. I was on Michigan Avenue Friday night after going to a restaurant. There was a sea of blue lights. I understand that's fairly common now, and the people in the area are welcoming it because it really is a deterrent to flash mobs and street violence. We know the grim numbers in this city. Over 4,000 Chicagoans have been shot this year, 4,000. In Cook County, there have been more than 1,000 homicides, overwhelmingly due to gun violence. Much of this gun violence, about half of it, is concentrated in 15 neighborhoods. But we know the reality. No neighborhood is immune. And the problem, as I mentioned, is not just limited to this city in this state. This is not just about numbers. It's about real people, real lives. It's about funerals and young lives taken too soon, and empty chairs at the dinner table for the families they leave behind. It's about parents losing children they love, children losing brothers and sisters, classmates losing friends, families and communities forever scarred. Over half the people murdered in Cook County this year were under 30 years of age. They had lives to live, families to care for and love, contributions they could make to this world. All of that was violently ended by a bullet. I think of young Michael Moultrie, MJ, a 4-year-old boy. He was getting his hair braided in an apartment in Woodlawn one afternoon in September. Car pulled up in front, 3 people jumped out and started firing at the building. 2 bullets hit him in the head. He died 48 hours later. 8 victims who were shot, 5 of them fatally in a mass shooting in Inglewood in June. One of them was Shamitria Williams. She was just getting ready to graduate from Country Club Hills Tech that very same day. Another, Denise Mathis, killed, leaving behind 5 children. I think of Woom Sing Se, a 71-year-old grandfather, murdered outside his home in Chinatown last week, shot more than 20 times in an execution-style killing by a so-called ghost gun. If you're not familiar with that term, please learn. That's a gun that's untraceable, assembled from parts with no serial numbers. And remember Azul de la Garza, 18-year-old who had an early start in social justice as a youth organizer in Gage Park, Azul was shot and killed while sitting in a parked car in West Elton neighborhood. Our thoughts and prayers are with the victims and loved ones, but as I've said many times, thoughts and prayers are not enough. Every single person who's been victimized by gun violence deserves justice. It's important that we solve these crimes and hold shooters accountable, but we also need to prevent these shootings from happening in the first place. Prosecutions after funerals don't bring back those we lost. Preventing violence requires all of us and an all-hands-on-deck effort. Coordinated, evidence-informed strategies that combine the work of law enforcement, community-based organizations, schools, the faith community, public health agencies, the business community, and virtually everyone else. One critical focus of prevention must be gun trafficking. Chicago is awash in guns, and they're largely being trafficked in from other places, elsewhere in Illinois and other states. In June, the Biden administration established the Department of Justice Firearms Trafficking Strike Force here in Chicago under the leadership of U.S. Attorney John Losh, who will testify today. I joined Attorney General Garland when he visited on July 22nd to announce the launch. The strike force brings federal, state, and local prosecutors and law enforcement agencies together to investigate and dismantle firearms trafficking schemes. Let's be clear, if we want to reduce shootings, we need to reduce the flow of illegal guns into this city and state. This is what the strike force is tasked to do. And we'll hear as well from Kristen DeTenio, the special agent in charge of ATF here in Chicago. I also look forward to hearing what the DOJ strike force is doing to combat straw purchasing. Straw purchasing came home to Chicago last August. My wife and I joined the thousands of people at Rita High School in Beverly when CPD officer Ella French held the memorial service was held for her. She had been killed on the street, and her partner, Carlos Yanez Jr., who I understand Congressman Garcia is friends of his family, he was seriously wounded. I pray for him every day. There was a routine traffic stop that ended up in one officer killed and another seriously wounded. What did we learn about the weapon they used? It was a murder weapon that was straw purchased in Indiana. I wrote Attorney General Garland and asked that the strike force make it a priority to focus on combating straw purchases. We'll also discuss with our witnesses how agencies are working across state lines, and we'll discuss investigative tools like crime gun tracing, NIBIN statistics. We'll also hear on our second panel from Chicago Police Superintendent David Brown. 85% of law enforcement is state and local. We want to make sure that the 15%, the federal side of it, is doing its part. I look forward to hearing from the superintendent about what we can do at the federal level to make his job better. And I look forward to hearing from the CPD and how they are trying to build new relationships and better relationships with people in the community. That's where community-based violence intervention programs also come in. We'll hear from the University of Chicago Crime Lab, which evaluates and supports programs like Ready Chicago that are producing meaningful results. Studies show these problems can reduce violence. There are many layers to the gun violence epidemic. I want to salute Governor Pritzker and acknowledge that he declared gun violence a public health crisis in Illinois last month. We have done so finally at the federal level. Today we'll hear from the Principal Deputy Director of CDC, our nation's public health agency. The CDC doesn't just study coronavirus and diabetes. It applies its strategy to health challenges in our community, including violence. So I'll lay out the mechanics here. We are joined by several members of the Illinois Congressional delegation, and I'm glad that they're here. I'm going to recognize them first and give them an opportunity to make brief member statements. I've been proud to partner with them, and I'll continue to. Senator Duckworth could not make this hearing this morning, but she's all in. She and I will be working together on this issue. After we hear from our House colleagues, we'll turn to our first panel. After I introduce and swear in the witness, each one will have 5 minutes for an oral statement and then questions and answers. Then we'll turn to our second panel. I now want to recognize my colleagues from Congress. I think Congresswoman Schakowsky is first up, and then Congressman Davis and Congressman Quigley. Sorry, I understand Congressman Davis is first up. Seniority is a very important thing in our business. Congressman Davis, my friend, take it away.
Age before beauty.
Make
Senator
sure
Durbin,
your microphone
members
on.
of the committee.
Check your microphone, Danny.
Yeah, I think it's here.
Okay.
Senator Durbin, members of the committee, fellow panelists, interested persons, and the general public. First of all, I thank Senator Durbin for holding this very important hearing and for once again raising the issue of the presence and impact of guns on the continuing rise of violent crime in our communities of Illinois and across the nation. It is clear to me, and should be clear, that the presence and ease of acquiring guns, the availability of guns, is an integral part of crime growth, and we must do everything in our power to reduce it, to curb it, and do a better job of controlling the presence and the flow of guns. We know that homicide with guns is a public health epidemic, and no matter what else we do, we must do a better job of controlling the flow. I don't usually talk about this issue from a personal perspective, but a little more than 3 years ago, I got a telephone call from a police commander who said, "Congressman Davis, I've got some bad news for you." And I said, "How bad?" He said, "Pretty bad." Then he gave me the name of a person and asked if I knew that person. And I said, "Yes, of course, that's my grandson." And he said, "I'm afraid that he has been shot." And I said, "How bad is it?" And he said, "He's gone." Well, I can tell you that since that night, his immediate family have not experienced a peaceful moment, nor have the families of the two young people who invaded his home and shot him. Neither have they experienced a peaceful moment. And both these young people are now serving 30 years in prison, and their families have been broken just as my family has been broken. And the interesting thing about the whole incident is, had there not been a gun, in all likelihood, it never would have happened. They knew each other. They interacted with each other, and they played a little game of swapping clothes and had a little argument. But one had a gun. And since that time, the repercussions have been felt. So, Senator Durbin, I thank you once again for raising this issue. And I also thank you for partnering with me on the informed care legislation that we both introduced to deal with the issue and the problems of traumatic experiences that people have had. And so we've got over 200 people, 200 organizations and groups who stood with us as we introduced it. I thank you again, and I thank you for raising the issue here today.
Danny, thank you for sharing that personal story. It hits home when someone that you respect and love, like you, felt this personally in your family. Thank you for your testimony. Congressman Schakowsky.
Thank you so much, Senator Durbin. I think it's so significant that you, as the chair of the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, are having this hearing, because what we know is that we have to have national legislation. I've heard you say before that right now anybody can go across the border to any state that borders on the state of Illinois, open up the trunk of their car, fill it up, and come across the border. We don't check cars and trunks at the border. And so our state and our cities are flooded. And we have good legislation, and I congratulate Governor Pritzker for signing a bill recently on background checks, popular with all 80% of Americans and more to have universal background checks, and yet we have not been able to move at the federal level to protect everyone. And Danny, your story, I was at that funeral. It was just the saddest thing that you lost your grandson. On November 28th, we lost Carl Dennison III, 17 years old, in Evanston, where there was a shooting. He was killed, and 4 others were injured, including kids from 14 to 18 years old in Evanston. None of our communities are really immune. 125 people on average die in the United States of America from gun violence, from guns. That includes suicide as well. That is not normal. Other nations in this world do not see that level of murder. They have people with mental illness. They have inequities in all kinds of ways, but they don't have the number of guns and the availability of guns on the street that are killing our children and our families. I wanted to point to one thing that is on the table right now. As part of the Build Back Better bill, $5 billion has been allocated for community violence intervention programs. These are programs that are based not so much on law enforcement, but really on a medical view of gun violence. And what it has proven is that these community programs that put people, often young people, people who know what's going on the street to intervene in the often retaliatory murders that go back and forth, to stop that. People who have sometimes experienced themselves with this kind of violence. And this program would do outreach and conflict mediation. It would have hospital-based violent interventions. It would have victim services, including traumatic-informed health care. And I think where it has been used, we have seen a reduction in crime, in gun violence, between 40 and 70%. And so this $5 billion that's in the BBB, the Build Back Better program, I'm hoping very much that this legislation will pass and that we'll be able to see another way to intervene, to stop on the street the violence that we see. So there are there's legislation that's been proposed and programs that we know can work, and I hope we'll move forward. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thanks, Congresswoman. And I might add that $5 billion is in the jurisdiction of this committee. And so we're hoping before Christmas that we can pass the reconciliation bill and we can start talking about specific ways to dedicate those funds to reducing crime and gun violence. Thank you very much. Congressman Mike Quigley.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for hosting this hearing, and thanks for your leadership. Illinois is very fortunate to have you working with us. And I appreciate being here with all my colleagues and moved by my colleague, Mr. Davis's story. It's good to be here with all my colleagues. It is notable that Mr. Davis and Mr. Garcia joined me as fellow Cook County Commissioners, the cradle of Congress, the Cook County Board. I look forward to working with all of you. But we have all spent too much time over the years meeting with the family and friends of victims. For them and for the community, we have to end the violence. While our state and local partners in this effort focus on the tragic debate of what happens after a gun is fired, we at the federal level have continuously fallen short on regulating an industry that puts dangerous weapons in our neighborhood and underfunding the agency tasked with enforcement. We have to stop the flow of illegal guns into our city, keep firearms out of the hands of criminals, and identify the root causes of gun violence. We all have different issues we focus on with this. I'd like to focus on just one. Thanks to a set of policies known as the T-Hart Amendments, the federal government is prohibited from requiring licensed gun dealers to report on their inventories. This prohibition makes it much more difficult to crack down on bad actors who sell guns to criminals and people who aren't allowed to purchase a firearm. It also renders the requirement that licensed gun dealers report stolen guns to the government effectively meaningless, because without good records, we can't track the guns. We know that almost 60% of the guns used in crimes come from just over 1% of licensed dealers. And rather than making common sense reforms to encourage good record keeping and make dealers explain when guns disappear, my colleagues across the aisle in the gun industry consistently place profits over people. I have previously introduced legislation to repeal this prohibition and mandate gun dealers maintain inventories. We plan to introduce it again next year. The Trafficking Reduction and Criminal Enforcement Act, or TRACE Act, would do away with the T-Hart Amendments and improve the traceability of firearms. The T-Hart Amendments make it as hard as possible to identify dealers that aren't law-abiding and allow the flow of guns to criminals and continue debate, which allows the flow of guns to criminals to continue unabated. We're all sick of it. Chicago is sick of it. Federal action is necessary. We're all committed to work with the advocates here in Chicago and my colleagues in D.C. to repeal these amendments and pass common sense gun reforms. Thank you again, Chairman, for your work.
Thanks, Congressman Quigley. It's an important legislation that you're supporting, and I support it as well. I want to thank this panel, and we want to invite the second panel of members of the House from Illinois, Congresswoman Robin Kelly, Sean Casten, and Chuy Garcia. If you please come forward, the clerk's going to switch the name cards and microphone covers. Congressman Kelly, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Senator Durbin and the Senate. Thank you to Senator Durbin and the Senate Judiciary Committee for hosting this crucial bill hearing in Chicago.
Is your mic on, Congressman? Thank you. You might pull a little closer.
My constituents, a 14-year-old boy, Kevin Tinker, was killed by senseless gun violence. A few days later, Kevin's mother, on her way home from visiting his memorial site, was also killed. These are not the only constituents of mine that have been lost to gun violence recently. Every week, the communities I represent have to deal with another shooting, another lost loved one, and the fear of going outside in their own neighborhood. We also have to continue to speak out about those that are shot but don't die. There are many more people in that situation. Someone I'm close to just recently, last week as a matter of fact, relayed to me that her dad had been shot. Chicago is used by some in the media as an example for why gun violence laws don't work, but they are missing the crucial part of the story. More than half of these guns, as we've heard, are coming from out of state. Both Indiana and Wisconsin, states on the border of Illinois, have weak gun laws and supply many of these guns. One gun store located across the state lines in Gary, Indiana, is responsible for the flow of hundreds, if not thousands, of illegal firearms. Last week, I introduced H.R. 6225, the Federal Firearm Licensee Act, to tackle the supply of the tools of gun violence. Federal law governing licensed firearm dealers has not been updated in more than 30 years. This bill expands the applicability of federal firearms laws to facilitators of firearms sales, such as sellers at gun shows and online marketplaces, which in several states are currently permitted to host large commercial marketplaces that allow for the sale of firearms without a background check. It also prioritizes inspection of high-risk dealers, requires licensees to transfer firearms and personal collection to business inventory prior to disposition, and creates regulations for the secure storage of firearms to prevent against theft. This bill removes appropriations riders that prevent the ATF from enforcing existing laws. It is also essential that we crack down on straw purchases. That's why I introduced H.R. 2280, the Prevent Gun Trafficking Act. This bill clarifies federal law to make it a federal crime to acquire a firearm for the possession of a third party. If an individual isn't allowed to buy a gun, they shouldn't be able to send someone else to buy it for them. Straw purchases are allowing guns to flow into the hands of dangerous individuals to conduct crime or violence. Individual murders don't get the national attention like mass shootings, but these everyday killings are destroying communities. This slow-motion massacre cannot continue. People are tired of waiting. Congress must act so no more children, no more mothers, no more innocent bystanders fall victim to this senseless gun violence. In more than 8 years in the U.S. House of Representatives, we have passed 2 bills related to gun violence, and still the Senate has not passed one. I urge my Senate colleagues to act, and I want to thank you, Senator Durbin, but also say it's not just about the legislation. We have to invest in communities, and we have to invest in people. And I'm proud to be one of the sponsors of the Prevent Violence Act in the Build Back Better, and hopefully, as you said, that'll be a nice Christmas present. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Congressman Caston.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, and the committee for hosting this hearing. As you know, I've only been in Congress now for 2 terms, and it strikes me that this is a monumentally easy problem that we talk about the wrong way. We just had too many guns. If we get rid of half the guns in the country tomorrow, we'd still have more guns per capita than any other country in the world. And until we talk about that, we're talking about the wrong problems. Now, today, I do, though, want to focus on gun trafficking as the subject of this hearing. The ATF has reported that nearly 60,000 guns are trafficked across state lines every year. Chicago police have seized more than 36,000 guns in a recent 5-year span, which is more than police in Los Angeles, New York, Houston, and several other major U.S. cities have seized. In this year alone, Chicago police are on track to recover over 12,000 guns, which will be a record high, and more than New York City and Los Angeles combined. When I asked some folks at the Chicago Crime Lab a while ago what it is that we're doing wrong, they said, well, New York and Los Angeles are not driving distance to Indiana. In Chicago, guns trafficked across state lines comprise about 60% of the total number of illegally possessed guns. Indiana, one state, Indiana, is the primary source for approximately 1 in 5 crime guns in Illinois and Chicago. One single gun stolen from a shop in Wisconsin was linked to at least 27 shootings in Chicago before it was removed from the streets. We're only as strong as our weakest link, and in spite of the good laws that we've passed in Illinois, we're undermined by the looser laws in our neighboring states. Now, in addition to that, as you know well, there is no federal gun trafficking law, so federal agents have to rely on these other weird statutes like lying on a firearms purchase form to prosecute gun trafficking cases or stop straw purchasers. And so we have to address this issue at the federal level. And as a key first step, simply requiring gun owners to act responsibly seems like an easy first move out of the door. My bill, H.R. 5245, the Gun Trafficker Detection Act, which has been co-sponsored by my friend Robin Kelly and Ted Deutsch in Florida, simply requires that any gun owner must report the theft or loss of a gun within 48 hours. If they do that, they're fine. If they don't, and that gun is subsequently used for a crime, that individual is responsible for civil penalties for any crime that goes with that. I think it's a common sense first step to simply say we respect people have reasonable reasons to own guns, we respect responsible gun owners, but we don't respect gun traffickers. As you can probably tell from my tone, I'm getting a little sick of these conversations. I've lost track of how many times we stand up on the House floor to acknowledge somebody who's been shot. I've lost track of how many statements we have to make saying that we've lost constituents or loved ones. And we tell ourselves we just can't do more because the public will isn't there. And the only thing I know for certain is that 100% of Americans don't want to get shot. Thank you. I yield back.
Thanks, Congressman Caston. Congressman Garcia.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, for convening this very important field hearing today. I'm here, of course, as the representative of the 4th District, which includes the southwest and northwest sides and suburban communities across Chicagoland. I'm here because gun violence is affecting my family, my neighbors, and the people that I represent. A little bit over 2 years ago, a 27-year-old young man was murdered in front of my home. That murder remains unsolved. 2 weeks ago, on a Friday night, my wife and I were watching a movie at home, and we heard 15 rounds of loud gunfire. I went outside to check to see if anyone had been hurt. I called the police. No one came. There were no ambulances. Fortunately, it appears no one was hurt. Friday night, we were watching television again at 7 p.m., and we heard 11 gunshots. We couldn't tell if it was in front or in back of our home. No police cars came, no ambulance. Fortunately, it appears no one was hurt. So I'm here today as a parent, as a friend, and as a neighbor. For the past 53 years, I've lived in the same neighborhood. I've been involved in violence prevention initiatives, working with my neighbors and seeking to improve relationships with the police as well. I've known too many people hurt or killed by gunfire. Young adults, elderly people, children, and of course the friends and families of victims who are left to deal with the impacts of gun violence on their lives. Something's got to change. What kind of world do we live in when our children have to learn to hide from bullets before they learn to tie their shoes? Our community is hurting and in constant fear. That's no way to live. I'm eager to hear today from today's witnesses about the cross-jurisdictional strike force created by the Department of Justice to address the flow of illegal guns to cities like Chicago. As many Chicagoans will tell you, most guns used in crimes come from out-of-state dealers. Preventing guns from reaching the street in the first place is a crucial part of violence reduction, so it's imperative that we address gun trafficking at its point of origin. But I want to be very clear on this point. There is no single easy solution to stopping gun violence in Chicago. To get to the root causes of violence, we must acknowledge the multi-generational disinvestment and criminalization of poor Latino and Black communities in Chicago. And we must fundamentally reinvest in those neighborhoods, invest in schools, in health, in care services, in criminal justice and police reform, economic mobility, and in job opportunities so that people can stay in their communities to live and work without fearing for their safety. Again, I deeply appreciate the opportunity to attend today's field hearing, and I look forward to hearing from everyone here, especially panelists and colleagues in the House and Senate, to finally make meaningful progress toward curbing gun violence in Chicago.
Thanks, Congressman Garcia. The attendance of 6 of my House colleagues and their heartfelt testimony really make a difference. And I thank you so much for being here today. We know what we hear from the people we represent. We know what we feel when it touches our families and the people we love. They expect us to do something, not just make speeches and not just have hearings. We've had 5 hearings so far this year in the Senate Judiciary Committee on the issue of gun violence. We are preparing now for a markup. You know what's going to happen as well as I do on an 11-11 committee. But I think it's important that members of the United States Senate go on record, be given a chance to vote for some of the legislation we've discussed this morning, and maybe, just maybe, there'll be a breakthrough in that conversation. Thank you for your participation this morning. Appreciate it so very much. I now want to introduce the witnesses for the first panel as we're changing microphones and nameplates. I'm going to read the backgrounds of the witnesses. John Losh, U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois, a district that covers 18 counties and 9 million people, including the city of Chicago. As U.S. Attorney, he oversees 300 employees, including 155 assistant U.S. attorneys. Before becoming U.S. Attorney in 2017, he previously served for more than a decade as an assistant U.S. Attorney, 5 years as the office's violent crime coordinator, BA from Harvard, law degree from Northwestern. Kristen DeTinio is a special agent in charge of the Chicago Field Division for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives, known as ATF. This field division covers northern and central Illinois, the Northern District of Indiana, and the Eastern District of Wisconsin. Ms. DeTinio has served with ATF for almost 20 years, since 2002, working as a special agent in Washington and Los Angeles, and currently serving as a tactical medic. Prior to joining ATF, she served as a nurse corps officer in the United States Navy, received her bachelor's degree from Marquette, master's from George Washington. Dr. Deborah Horry, did I pronounce it correctly? Oury. Dr. Deborah Oury is the acting principal deputy director of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC. Since 2014, Dr. Oury has served as the director of CDC's National Center for Injury Prevention and Control, where she has led research and science-based programs to prevent injuries and violence. Before joining the CDC, she worked as a physician and professor at the Department of Emergency Medicine at Emory University and Emory University Hospital. She received her MD and MPH degrees from Tulane. So, as is the custom of this committee, I'd ask the witnesses to please stand to be sworn. Please raise your right hand. Do you affirm the testimony you're about to give before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Mr. Lodge, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. I appreciate being here today to discuss this very important issue. I've had the privilege to serve as the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois for the past 4 years. The district covers 18 counties with a total population of approximately 9 million people. There are approximately 150 assistant United States attorneys in Chicago and Rockford and another 150 support staff. I myself was an assistant U.S. attorney in this district from 1999 through 2010. During that time, I worked as a deputy chief in the narcotics and gangs section of that office, and I also served as our office's violent crime coordinator, leading the district's anti-gang and Project Safe Neighborhoods programs. Throughout my tenure, I've had many conversations about what's driving violence in Chicago. The answer is never a simple one. The causes of violent crime are many and varied and can change over time, and that holds true around the country and in Chicago. Right now, Chicago, like many places throughout the country, is seeing increases in youth violence and violent criminals emboldened to a degree that we haven't seen in some time, certainly more than I've seen in some time. They are emboldened to carry guns and to use them. According to Chicago Police Department data, through December 5th of this year, there were 756 murders in Chicago, which is 4% more than last year at this time, and 3,347 reported shooting incidents, which is up 9%. Homicides in Chicago hit a several-decade low in 2014, just a handful of years ago, when the city recorded 426 homicides. Troublingly, Chicago has significantly exceeded this level of homicides in every year since 2014 and exceeded it by more than 80% in several years, including 2016, 2020 last year, and likely this year, 2021. Federal law enforcement's role in fighting violent crime is primarily to support the work of the brave men and women in state and local police departments who comprise 85% of law enforcement officers in the country. We are fortunate to have strong partnerships with the Chicago Police Department and other state and local law enforcement throughout Northern Illinois. Our violent crime reduction efforts in the U.S. Attorney's Office are part of the Department of Justice's overall Project Safe Neighborhoods initiative. Project Safe Neighborhoods, or PSN for short, is a promising evidence-based program aimed at reducing violent crime. Through PSN, a broad spectrum of stakeholders work together to identify the most pressing violent crime problems in the community and develop comprehensive solutions to address them. As part of this strategy, PSN focuses enforcement efforts on the most violent offenders and partners with locally based prevention and reentry programs for lasting reductions in crime. In the last 3 fiscal years in which they've been awarded, our district's PSN grants have provided valuable support to the program by funding strategic enforcement initiatives, academic research, community outreach, and crime prevention and disruption programs. And many of those are outlined a little further in my written statement. As I noted earlier, violent crime reduction is addressed primarily at the local level by local law enforcement and local government and community programs that work to prevent it. Indeed, most violent crime does not violate federal law. For example, there's no federal statute criminalizing murder absent special circumstances, such as in a uniquely federal jurisdiction or when committed against an officer of the federal government, or unless those murders are committed as part of a larger criminal enterprise. That's why the most effective use of federal law enforcement resources against violent crime is as a supplement and in support of these critical local efforts, and why here in Chicago, our federal efforts to focus on investigating and prosecuting gangs and other groups who work in concert to commit crimes involving violence, including murders and shootings, robberies, carjackings, drug trafficking, and of course, firearms trafficking. These include prosecutions of members of the large traditional gangs that have a long history of violence in Chicago, as well as smaller groups such as robbery and carjacking crews. These investigations typically involve multiple agencies working alongside local police, most notably the Chicago Police Department. The federal charges we have brought often include federal racketeering and conspiracy laws that are specifically tailored to address crimes by individuals acting in concert with others who advance the group's interests. We supplement these larger investigations with individual prosecutions of violent offenders who are driving crime and violence in Chicago's neighborhoods. Typically, these prosecutions rely on the federal law criminalizing the unlawful possession of firearms by convicted felons. During my time as U.S. Attorney, we've created a gun crimes prosecution team to enhance our efforts to prosecute those cases. And again, that's outlined in a little more detail in my written statement as well. We also need to address and are addressing straw purchasers and firearms traffickers who enable the unlawful possession of firearms and the violence that follows. This summer, the department announced the formation of 5 cross-jurisdictional strike forces, one of which is based here in Chicago, to disrupt illegal firearms trafficking. As part of the Chicago Strike Force, my office collaborates with ATF and other federal, state, and local law enforcement partners in our district and across the country to help stem the supply of illegally trafficked firearms and to identify patterns, leads, and potential suspects in violent gun crimes. The Chicago Strike Force is enhancing our longstanding efforts to hold accountable those individuals or groups who illegally traffic firearms into Chicago. And finally, public safety in our district also continues to be threatened by illegal trafficking of drugs, including heroin and other opioids, cocaine, and fentanyl. And in particular, we focus on those organizations that use violence and firearms to protect and to promote those drug trafficking activities. I would be happy to discuss today specific examples of our violent crime prosecutions, but obviously my time is limited, and I'm sure you have questions to ask. For case examples, I would refer you and to others to a news release that our office issued on November 29th of this year entitled Update on Federal Prosecutions and Ongoing Strategies to Combat Violent Crime in Chicago. This release is available on our website for the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Chicago. We release it twice a year, and prior releases on our website as well. And we do this so that the community knows what we're doing on multiple levels to address violent crime in Chicago. Thank you again for inviting me today, Senator Durbin, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lush. Ms. Detenio from ATF.
Chairman Durbin and members of the committee, including Ranking Member Grassley, thank you for the invitation to appear before you to discuss the efforts of ATF and our partners in combating firearms trafficking and reducing violence in Chicago. My name is Kristen Detenio, and I'm the Special Agent in charge of ATF's Chicago Field Division. It is my great honor to represent the men and women of ATF before you today. As a career Special Agent, I have served in field and management positions across the country, experiencing collaboration and partnership everywhere I have served. As the SAC of the Chicago Field Division, I draw from that experience to lead an extraordinary team of special agents, industry operations investigators, intelligence professionals, and support staff in partnership with my state, local, and federal counterparts to protect the public from violent firearms crime. The cornerstone of ATF's criminal enforcement strategy to address gun violence is crime gun intelligence, or known as CGI, the gathering of all known information about the history of a crime gun and those who trafficked, unlawfully possessed, or used that firearm. Two key components of crime gun intelligence are ATF's National Integrated Ballistics Information Network, or NIBIN, and firearms tracing conducted by ATF's National Tracing Center. ATF's NIBIN system is the only national network that allows for the capture and comparison of ballistic evidence to aid in solving and preventing violent crimes involving firearms. The Chicago Police Department is actively engaged with the NIBIN program, using NIBIN machines to enter recovered ballistic evidence into our system. To further enhance the effectiveness of NIBIN in Chicago, since 2019, ATF's National NIBIN Correlation and Training Center has provided correlation review services and other support to the Chicago Police Department. Correlation review is a challenging aspect of effectively using NIBIN because it is labor-intensive and time-consuming. The Correlation Center's highly trained specialists provide prompt correlation review and results, helping to ensure timely dissemination of actionable leads to investigators. Access to the Correlation Center is enhancing the effectiveness of NIBIN in Chicago, which is an essential step in identifying, investigating, and prosecuting those responsible for violent gun crime. An equally important component of crime gun intelligence is firearms tracing. ATF is the sole agency in the United States authorized to trace firearms for law enforcement. The ATF National Tracing Center is the only crime gun tracing facility in the country. Thus far, in 2021, more than 3,000 shootings and over 700 homicides have occurred in Chicago. These are not just numbers on a page. Each of these numbers represents a child who has lost a parent who has lost a child, a family devastated by gun violence. The ATF Chicago Field Division remains dedicated to our mission to build and strengthen partnerships to address gun violence. The Firearms Trafficking Strike Force in Chicago is a clear example of sustained and focused coordination among state, local, and federal law enforcement partners across jurisdictions to disrupt firearms trafficking networks. Addressing firearms trafficking is only one component of ATF's strategy in Chicago to disrupt the shooting cycle by identifying and targeting those who illegally transfer firearms, those who illegally possess firearms, and those who use firearms to commit violence. These types of investigations and prosecutions span from a single defendant charged with illegal possession of a firearm to the investigation and prosecution of criminal organizations to the cross-jurisdictional investigation of firearms trafficking schemes. Examples include, in July of 2020, a Chicago man who fired a gun into the grave of a murder victim during his burial service, endangering the mourners, was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to one count of illegal possession of a firearm. Last month, a federal indictment was unsealed charging 13 alleged leaders, members, and associates of the Wicked Town faction of the traveling Vice Lord Street Gang with participating in a criminal organization that murdered 19 people and protected a drug dealing operation utilizing firearms on the west side of Chicago. In October of this year, a superseding indictment added additional carjacking and firearms charges against a Chicago man accused of murdering a rideshare driver during a carjacking earlier this year. And also in October, 4 men were charged with federal firearms offenses for allegedly trafficking firearms from St. Louis to Chicago. These examples highlight ATF's commitment to impactful investigative work, none of which is possible without the strong partnerships among state, local, and federal law enforcement and the U.S. Attorney's Office. Under the exceptional leadership of United States Attorney John Lausch and with our partners, including the Chicago Police Department and the Illinois State Police, we are leveraging resources through the Firearms Trafficking Strike Force to ensure coordination across jurisdictions to disrupt entire trafficking networks, from the states where firearms are diverted to illegal commerce and ultimately to the places where they are used in violent crime. We utilize crime gun intelligence to focus our resources to effectively meet that mission. We are systematically attacking gun violence and disrupting the shooting cycle that too often begins with a straw purchase, an unlicensed dealer, or a gun theft miles away and ends in tragedy in our Chicago neighborhoods. Chairman Durbin and members of the committee, at the beginning of my statement, I mentioned that I am a special agent, having spent my whole career dedicated to ATF's mission of reducing violent crime and working collaboratively with my partners. Now, as the head of the ATF Chicago Field Division, it is no different. Our mission is accomplished through both criminal and regulatory enforcement. We must leverage technology, use crime gun intelligence to allocate our resources, but most importantly, stand shoulder to shoulder with our state, local, and federal law enforcement partners to continue our legacy of using great partnerships to bring those who inflict unspeakable harm on our communities to justice. Together, we are making a difference in our communities. Thank you for allowing me to appear before you today.
Thank you very much, Ms. Detenio. Dr. Howery?
Good morning, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. I am Dr. Deb Howery, the Acting Principal Deputy Director, and for the last 7 years, the Director of the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control at the CDC. I've spent my career split between being an ER doc and a public health professional, learning from and hearing from families impacted by violence, and committing to do my best to reduce it. I'm honored to be here today with my justice colleagues to represent the public health perspective of community violence. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Chairman Durbin, for your leadership in the prevention of community violence and adverse childhood experiences. As I was preparing for our discussion today, I thought of the trip Secretary Becerra made here last month to hear about violence prevention work. Sadly, the importance of the work was underscored when less than 2 hours after the visit, 2 separate shooting incidents occurred. I know how Chicago is directly affected by community violence, and my heart breaks for everyone affected, not just for the widely publicized acts of violence, but for those who are also impacted by the daily violence not heard in the media. Violence is, unfortunately, everywhere, from assaults that occur in a community to child abuse and even mass shootings. We know that it happens in rural and urban communities around our nation. We also know that rates of homicide and injuries from assaults continue to increase, and with that, there are significant short and long-term consequences for individuals of all ages. Youth and adolescents who experience violence as victims, perpetrators, or witnesses have experienced what is referred to as an adverse childhood experience or an ACE. Violence experienced at a young age can actually change the way a child's brain develops. People who experience ACEs are more likely to have chronic physical and mental health conditions that can lead to an increased risk of suicide, drug overdose, and heart disease. This underscores that community violence has long-lasting effects on the most vulnerable, children. The good news is that violence is preventable. While it is critical that we work collectively to stop the violence that is occurring right now, we must address the factors that put people at risk of either perpetrating or becoming a victim of violence as early as possible. We do that by collecting data to understand when and why violence and injuries occur and how to prevent it. The National Violent Death Reporting System is now nationwide, and this system pulls data from multiple sources to better understand violent deaths. We have also made recent investments in data collection in 10 state health departments to identify hotspots of non-fatal firearm injuries. These data help communities determine what prevention efforts would be most appropriate and to improve their ability to respond. We also support research and programmatic efforts. For example, we fund the Youth Violence Prevention Centers. Each center is a local partnership of an academic community collaboration that implements and rigorously evaluates innovative strategies to prevent youth and community violence, and in doing so, builds the evidence base for what works best in communities. CDC has also supported cities and local health departments to engage in youth violence prevention activities. Local health departments are well positioned to support violence prevention efforts because of their access to data, relationships with the communities they serve, partnerships across multiple sectors, and experience working with young people. The Minneapolis City Health Department implemented Coaching Boys into Men, which encourages nonviolent problem-solving skills through sports. After year 4 of the program, students improved 36% in recognizing abuse, 47% in likelihood to intervene in violent situations, and violent crime arrests decreased 20% among youth. Because community violence results from multiple factors, the use of a single strategy will have limited impact. A comprehensive public health approach targets multiple risk and protective factors, as well as focuses on both reducing violence right now and in the long term. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Dr. Howery. Let me start with Mr. Loesch. We were together on July 22nd when Attorney General Garland came to the city of Chicago. We were with the mayor and made some important stops that day. It was for the announcement of the Chicago Strike Force, and I thank you for your leadership in that regard. The urgency of the problem that we face has been repeated over and over again. Let me ask you a very basic thing. After the announcement of the creation of this task force, did you see an input of any new resources, of money coming to your office, ability to hire additional people for this purpose?
At the time, Senator, there was not an additional input of resources for money or new AUSAs or things like that. What did happen, which was incredibly important, was whenever the Department of Justice prioritizes something like firearms trafficking, United States attorneys across the country realize that it is a way they need to mobilize the resources they have towards that particular area. And so our office had already focused on firearms trafficking, but we added more resources, more people to focus on cases like that. And around the country, it was the same thing. We really overall kind of enhanced our efforts to really prioritize those cases.
It's a zero-sum situation, is it not? You had to take those resources from something else that you were spending them on.
That's what happens, any time you're a prosecutor. You're always prioritizing based upon not only what an initiative that might come up, but what you see on the ground. I mean, to give you another example, when the carjackings increased significantly in Chicago over the last couple of years, we've spent more time doing carjacking cases than we had before as well. So we're addressing the particular issues that we see in front of us. So.
Well, I certainly hope that we can improve that situation for you at the federal level by sending the additional resources that might make a difference. We read about the RICO and Vicar actions that are being taken against individuals to try to break up these gangs. That seems to me to be a pretty labor-intensive effort, is it not, among the attorneys?
It is. It's a very labor-intensive effort, but it's an impactful one. And just to provide one quick example, one of the cases that Special Agent in Charge Detinio mentioned was a recent case we charged, and I won't get too far into the details. 13 individuals were charged. We alleged 19 murders, 19 attempted murders in that particular case. This just came out recently. We are already hearing feedback from our local law enforcement partners that is having a positive impact in the community. Members of the community see that we are doing something to hold people accountable for murders, and also it is having a deterrent effect of people not wanting to be the next person to get charged federally. So it is resource intensive. It is something we keep our eye on all the time, but it's important that we do organizational cases like that.
It's my understanding that over the years, the structure of gangs in Chicago has changed. There was a time when there were 3 or 4 headliners, overlords. Many of them were arrested and imprisoned. But now I'm told that it's been dispersed. There could be a gang that just has a square block that they consider their own territory. Doesn't that make it difficult to use RICO and Vicar to disperse the gangs if they are proliferating?
So twofold on your initial premise. That's certainly a fair statement, and I've seen the same thing, Mr. Chairman. We've seen the gangs, the large nation gangs broken down by factions. That's certainly something we've seen. But what we've also seen with that is we've seen more violence that's based not necessarily on protecting a drug corner, for instance. We've seen more violence based upon, internal disputes, more violence based upon social media, back and forth, and retaliation. And in that situation, we've used VICAR in particular, which is violent crime and aid of racketeering, in order to charge individuals even for one particular murder, if it is in furtherance of their racketeering activity. And so those are still important tools to use even with smaller groups. So your point is a fair one, but that tool can still be effective in trying to disrupt the violence of those types of groups.
Let's address straw purchasing for a moment. As I mentioned earlier, my wife and I went down to Rita High School. There were blocks and blocks of law enforcement officials coming to pay their respects to Ella French. It was a moving moment. You just sensed that there was deep feelings about what happened to that wonderful young police officer who lost her life in service to us. Straw purchasing generated the gun that killed her. It seems to me that that still haunts us in terms of gun stores and gun dealers who are willing to look the other way when someone is obviously buying guns they can't personally use, either by the nature of the gun or the volume of the purchase. I'm told that many times the U.S. Attorney's Office doesn't prosecute these crimes because the penalties are so low, and they're just taken as bookkeeping violations. Explain to me your attitude toward that and what you've done about it.
Certainly, we, in our office and in other offices across the country, we view straw purchasing as a serious crime. There are challenges sometimes to being able to prove those cases. Oftentimes, straw purchasing, it is making a false statement on a form that, at a federal firearms licensee. But when we are able to prove those cases, prove someone guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, we charge them. And it's important that we charge them in order to show potential straw purchasers that they will end up with a felony conviction for buying a gun, even if it's for a loved one. But if it's a loved one who has a felony conviction, they should not be receiving that gun. ATF works hard. We work hard on identifying the types of cases that we think will be able to prosecute and make an impact.
Can you produce some numbers to show prosecutions for straw purchases and what's happened to them over the years that you've been in this office?
So I don't have numbers with me here today. Senator Durbin would be happy to look further into that. I would point you to the press release that I mentioned that we put out twice a year for the last several years since I've been the U.S. Attorney. We do identify the straw purchasing cases that we do in those circumstances.
If I wanted to legally purchase a gun in Indiana, Northwest Indiana, from a gun dealer, do you know what I'm required to do?
So I don't know specifically what you would be required to do. I know in Illinois you would need a FOID card in order to purchase that firearm. In other states they have their own specific things that they would need to do. But one thing for sure, if you were a felon, you would not be able to purchase that gun legally in the state of Indiana.
Let me ask Ms. Titinio, can you tell me what I'm legally required to do if I'm a resident of Illinois? Let's assume I have a FOID card, and I want to go to Indiana to purchase a gun because they have a lower sales tax on firearms. What do I have to do?
So, Chairman, that's a good question in that the federal laws require you to be a resident of the state in which you are purchasing the firearm. There are certain ways to do it where you can purchase it in Indiana and have it shipped to a licensed dealer in Illinois. If you're an Illinois resident, you would still need the FOID card. But if you're asking if you as an Illinois resident can just go to an Indiana gun store and say, I'd like to buy a firearm, you cannot do that. You need to be a resident of the state in which the FFL is located unless you are having it shipped to an FFL in your state.
So I can't understand why we have a problem. If persons from Illinois can't purchase guns in Indiana except going through this bureaucracy, what's the problem?
So, a challenging question for sure. So in your question, what I was getting at is if you are a resident to purchase from an FFL, you can do that. In my testimony, you cannot do that. In my testimony, I mentioned unlicensed dealing as a definite diverter of legal firearms. So in which case, it doesn't matter. You as an Illinois resident can then go buy a gun from anybody who's willing to sell it to you who does not have a license.
Doesn't have to be a gun show either, does it?
No, it does not.
So it seems to me that this is a fiction we have created, that somehow this Illinois resident is going to go get a FOID card, do a background check, go to an Indiana dealer, purchase a firearm, then have the firearm transferred by that dealer to an Illinois dealer where I would take possession. How often does that happen?
To be honest, I don't know the answer to that. If you're talking about how often do the firearms show up in crimes, it's not because they were transferred from an Indiana dealer to an Illinois dealer.
What percentage of firearms do you know are responsible for gun crimes in Illinois that originate in Indiana?
I don't have the exact number. Illinois, like most states in the country, is its greatest source of firearms. It makes a lot of sense in terms of geography. In relation to Chicago, we have the western suburbs. We also have Indiana, also very much in close proximity. But Illinois does remain the #1 source of firearms for Chicago.
According to ATF records in fiscal year 2020, the ATF Chicago Field Division conducted 86 firearms compliance inspections of federally licensed gun dealers. Of those 86 inspections, 45 federally licensed gun dealers had no violations, 41 found violations of firearm laws or regulations. Can you tell me if that was a regular year, an exceptionally large number of inspections, or otherwise?
So calendar year 2020 was challenging throughout the entire country, and differing COVID restrictions, differing issues with personnel due to illness and things like that have made 2020 a difficult year to look at in terms of numbers. What I can say for sure is that in this year, we have hired additional industry operations investigators. We have built an additional industry operations group in the Chicagoland area, and have made some significant changes to our management of our industry operations program in the field division.
According to ATF data, other field divisions conducted significantly more gun dealer inspections in that same year, fiscal year 2020. For example, the Kansas City and Dallas field divisions each conducted over 850 inspections. We did 86. Why the difference?
So I think there's a number of reasons that could give a difference to that. I spend my time focused on our field division and what is most impactful to us. There are a number of reasons why there could be differences, including COVID restrictions in the areas, including staffing, including just overall numbers of dealers. It's important to note that Chicago itself is a humongous portion of our field division, and there are no federally licensed firearms dealers within Chicago.
But 10 times the number of inspections in Kansas City and Dallas?
And Senator Durbin, I think what is very important in this is to note crime gun intelligence, and we are excited to see that some of our other field divisions are able to conduct a number of inspections like that, so that when we have firearms flowing to us from somewhere else, we do have the resources there to look at those dealers. Those numbers don't necessarily encapsulate everything. If an inspection takes a much longer period of time, a dealer that has a humongous inventory, it takes a much greater amount of time to conduct an inspection than it does in a smaller dealer with fewer items in inventory.
Still, 10 times as many inspections. Let me speak to you about ghost guns. In 2016, there were 2 ghost guns that were recovered in Chicago. In 2020, there were 139. Last year, you told me, when we met in October, you told me that this year, out of 10,000 crime guns recovered by the CPD, 375 were ghost guns. So from 2 in 2016 to 139 in 2020 to 375 this calendar year so far. Maybe more now. Is this a trend we should be worried about?
I think it's a trend that we should absolutely keep our eyes on. The name ghost gun is not a scientific or term for it, but we use it because of the lack of traceability. So it is a very important trend for us to keep our eye on.
Tell me if I'm describing this correctly. These people order over the internet the component parts of a gun that don't have any serial number identification on them. Then they assemble them and use them as you would an ordinary gun. Is that correct?
Yes. So we use the term ghost gun to apply to a privately made firearm, so that by its nature is not required to have a serial number if it's kept for personal use.
I find it hard to believe that ATF's regulatory definition of a firearm does not include unfinished frames and receivers that can be easily converted into operable firearms with ghost gun assembly kits. Have you heard anything within the agency about responding to that deficiency?
I know that currently there is a NPRM, a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, being undertaken by ATF and the department, but that is not something that I have any expertise in.
we're going to take a look at that in Washington. Mr. Losh, what specific steps is the U.S. Attorney's Office taking in conjunction with local law enforcement to combat carjackings?
So over time, we have had particular task forces that have worked with the Chicago Police Department, and we've had FBI specifically and ATF working with Chicago Police Department to identify patterns of carjackings, and ultimately when there is an individual who's arrested, for us to look at those cases to determine whether or not we can charge that person federally. If there is a string of carjackings, can we charge a conspiracy to commit carjackings and things like that. But it has been a significant focus of ours and our federal law enforcement partners for some time now.
I noticed that Sheriff Dart made an appeal to the automobile manufacturers to do something to help. Are you aware of anything that they are considering or might be doing?
I'm not aware of Sheriff Dart's outreach to them or anything in particular.
I'm just wondering if I'm told there's more technology in our cars than we know, and it could be that there is something they could do where we could trace these cars, their whereabouts after the carjacking.
I can't speak to the car manufacturers, what they're doing or not doing. What I can tell you is that we use all the tools that we can, both federally and in state law enforcement when there is a carjacking, gathering evidence through things like navigation devices and things like that in cars in order to determine whether or not we can, follow the vehicles and ultimately, get enough evidence to charge people for them.
Mr. Tenio, I'd like to have you address the issue of thefts from gun dealers. Thousands of guns are stolen each year from these gun dealers. One of the measures that I've introduced with Congressman Brad Schneider of Illinois, called the Secure Firearms Storage Act, would require gun dealers to secure their inventory after business hours to decrease these thefts. How important is this issue?
So there are a number of ways that guns are diverted from legal commerce, and one of those is by theft. We in the Chicago Field Division and throughout ATF respond to every single theft that's reported from an FFL because we do believe that every one of those guns is destined to be part of a crime. So it is very important. We do a lot of outreach in conjunction with the U.S. Attorney's Office, and one of the topics that we do discuss with FFLs is encouraging securing their inventory, maintaining positive control of their inventory.
So when you do the inspections, is that one of the things you look for?
It's not one of our regulations, but it is something that we discuss with them when we do our inspections.
That
Because
seems so basic. We know that smash and grab gun up in Wisconsin ended up in, 27 different shootings before we finally took it out of circulation. And we have thousands of guns each year, as you mentioned, stolen and likely to be involved in crime. I don't know, I think Congress has an important responsibility here that we haven't reached, and we should. Tell me about NIBIN. Is the strike force effectively using NIBIN to assist trafficking investigations?
yes, in my testimony, I spoke about tracing and NIBIN both. They're both critical components to us allocating our resources and identifying traffickers. So NIBIN is the ballistics evidence matching, and we use that really to shorten our time to crime. So the moment that we know the gun was purchased to the time that it's used in a crime and its recovery by law enforcement.
I went on a personal crusade to try to get police departments across Illinois, every one of them, to do crime gun tracing so that we can at least figure out what's happening to these guns, how they're moving around. And is the strike force ensuring that ATF's E-Trace system is being used in these trafficking investigations?
Yes, all of our Chicago Field Division spends time with our departments explaining the importance of comprehensive tracing to all of them.
As I understand, tracing in our state is done through the state police.
So tracing is done by ATF. Illinois State Police does trace their firearms through us, as do most of the other agencies in the area.
So what percentage of law enforcement agencies do you think are sending this information in to either the state police or to you?
I wish that I knew the exact percentage of it. I know that we have a lot of data that we are able to use to focus our efforts every day.
What message would you send to those police departments who don't take the time to report these crime guns for tracing?
I would do the same thing that I've done today at your pleasure to speak to them the importance of knowing the history of a gun and how it enhances efforts to stop violent crime in their community.
Thank you. Dr. Ari, it's been quite a few years ago that I went to the juvenile facility in Cook County here, and these were teenagers, adolescents, waiting for trial, sometimes waiting as long as 2 years. And within the building, the juvenile facility, there's a high school with classrooms and a cafeteria and a gym. And it looks like a regular high school. Of course, the students are confined to the premises there. But I sat down with the counselors to the students and said, who are these kids? How do they end up being shooters or being involved in gangs that are killing people? And they said, almost every mental illness that you can imagine we find here. But there's one recurring theme. Over 90% of them were victims or witnesses of trauma, and it changed their lives. You said as much in your testimony. You also said that it's preventable, violence is preventable. The question I need to ask you, and I want on the record here, is trauma treatable?
Well, thank you for that question. Trauma is treatable, it's also preventable. And when I look at what we can do from CDC and with communities, it's really having many different strategies to prevent that trauma from happening in the first place. So programs in schools that teach youth how to mediate conflict, job training programs, hospital-based interventions like the HEAL initiative, really working in communities around community greening and connectedness. That all provides the protective factors. To treat trauma, there's things like trauma-informed care and making sure people get linked to the resources they need so that they don't continue to experience that trauma. But preventing trauma is something that we're very committed to.
And so when you look at the issue of trauma and consider where we are today, we know that because of COVID-19 and the interruption of regular school attendance, that several things have happened. One of them, sadly, was an increase in domestic violence. And one of the ACEs, the adverse childhood experience, is being involved in domestic violence or witnessing domestic violence. A boyfriend or a husband beats up your mother in your presence, and you see it as a child. And it has an impact on you, as it would, that kind of situation. We also realize that many of these young people are not getting even the most basic counseling day in and day out because they're separated from the classroom and the teacher. Not that every teacher is a good counselor, but many of them are, and that's lacking as well. So we have these kids now trickling back to school, in and out because of COVID. And we're being warned by national experts that there's a greater incidence of mental health issues. Would you reflect on that for a moment?
Sure, and I think, when we look at homicides, mental health plays a very small role in it. The majority of perpetrators of homicide are not mentally ill. With COVID, we certainly have seen an increase in mental health distress. We have not seen an increase in suicide deaths. My concern is because of many of the risk factors that you raise, we might see an increase in suicide deaths at a later date because of economic issues, this social isolation, disruption to daily routine. When we reflect on what can we do now, given these changes due to COVID, we've actually seen a lot of innovation, and I'm one of those optimists that believe there's a lot we can do. We've seen in South Carolina virtual programs to target ACEs, to where families are brought together through strengthening families. I saw in Colorado they did virtual mentoring programs for youth to have that connectedness. I have a 12-year-old. She's much more savvy at technology than I am, and during the pandemic was able to have probably more playdates and connectedness than pre-pandemic. So I think really tapping into how do we strengthen those protective factors of connectedness, communities that care, and really looking at how can you, if it's not that parent, maybe it's that teacher, maybe it's that neighbor that you can have that mentoring relationship with, and look for opportunities for additional education or training, even remote. So I do believe that a lot of these protective factors will mitigate what we've seen with COVID.
Years ago, I attended a grade school, Chicago Public Grade School, and they were using meditation as part,
Yes.
calm classrooms, they called it. And they asked me to sit quietly, which is a challenge for a politician, to sit quietly for 10 minutes while the kids were at their tables and desks and had meditation in the morning. And so I tried. I think I pulled it off pretty well. But I noticed that in that classroom, in that quiet classroom, there was one little boy who was not doing well. He was fidgeting and looking around and clearly was not happy with this challenge. I went to the teacher after the class and said, I'm guessing the little boy in the checkered shirt there has an issue. She said, yes. And it came down to trauma issue, some things that were going on in his home. And I said to her, so what do you do as a teacher of that boy? She said, I'm a teacher. I teach math. I'm not a psychologist or a counselor. I've got to find someone that I can bring in for this little boy. And that struck me as one of the real challenges. We need more and more people who are involved in social work and mental health counseling to intervene and treat those who are apparently victims of trauma. What is your response to that from the CDC perspective?
So I think certainly trauma-informed care is really important, and I think there can be a lot of training done for teachers. And in the emergency department, we had to use trauma-informed care because many patients would come in and might not be happy to see me after a trauma, and seeing me in the emergency department could re-traumatize them. So knowing how to approach a patient in a caring, non-judgmental way, same thing for teachers in schools. Not assuming that that child is wearing the same clothes from yesterday or didn't complete their homework because they're lazy. You don't know what's going on in their house, and to approach them with compassion, refer them to resources when appropriate. Certainly we need more. I think COVID has really shown a light that we need more on prevention and public health and treatment. And I think going back to prevention, if we can have these programs in schools that focus on strengthening families, building skills so that kids have what they need to cope, that can even lessen additional trauma they might face at a future date.
Thank you, Dr. Ari, and thanks to this panel. We're going to be back in touch with you formally and informally, perhaps some written questions, but more importantly on an informal basis to see what we're doing. I mean, the fact that so many of my House colleagues came, and there are other elected officials in the room who were invited to witness this as well, tells you that this is something you hear about every day and we hear about every day. And people are expecting us to be mindful of the challenge that we face and do something about it, not just hold a hearing, but actually do something. I'm hoping we can do that. I hope the Resources and Reconciliation will help us put money into violence intervention. I'm hoping to find resources, Mr. Lausch, to help you on the prosecutorial side as well as the police side of this equation as well. I would be remiss if I didn't mention this as well. We are also living in a period of time when justice and equality is being openly discussed as it should be in this country. We know George Floyd's situation, Laquan McDonald, we know all of those instances. I've spoken to police, members of the police force around our state in private and confidential settings. I've never heard anybody try to explain away those situations. They understand that this was a gross departure from what is expected of people in law enforcement. We have got to combine ways of effectively reducing crime with ways of increasing the relationship and communication between members of our community and law enforcement. We've got to try to bring trust into this equation. It's not easy. I think we all understand it's part of our responsibility as well. But thank you so much. Is there any closing comment that anyone would like to make? I give them a chance now.
I will one sentence, just on your last point. I think one of the things that law enforcement focuses on and needs to continue to do in developing that community trust is to hold people accountable for the crimes they commit. I think that is critically important. Everything here is critically important. But the more that we are able to hold people accountable for the crimes they're committing, whether it's a murder, a shooting, someone who's possessing a firearm who shouldn't have it, or someone who's giving a firearm to someone who shouldn't have it, that will help build faith in the community. So I thought it was worthwhile to make that point because I think that's critically important to really give the community faith in the people that they're working with on a regular basis.
Thank you. Thanks for your testimony this morning.
Thank you.
Timely and important. Dismiss the first panel and bring the second panel before us. I'm going to be reading their backgrounds as they're being seated. David Brown is the 63rd Superintendent of the Chicago Police Department, a position he's held since April of 2020. At CPD, Superintendent Brown oversees more than 12,000 police officers serving and protecting the residents of Chicago. Under his leadership, CPD has created a gun investigation team to focus on disrupting the flow of traffic guns. Before joining CPD, Superintendent Brown served for more than 25 years in the Dallas Police Department, starting as a patrol officer, rising to the rank of Chief of Police. BA from Dallas Baptist University, MBA from Amberton University. As is the practice of the Senate Judiciary Committee, the minority party on the committee has the right to call a witness, and they have called Amy Swearer. Ms. Swearer is a legal fellow in the Heritage Foundation's Edwin Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies, where her scholarship focuses on the Second Amendment, overcriminalization, school safety, and the intersection of gun violence and mental health. Prior to joining Heritage, she clerked at the Lancaster County Public Defender's Office in Lincoln, Nebraska. Law degree from the University of Nebraska College of Law. Roseanne Ander, founding executive director at the University of Chicago Crime Lab, created in 2008. The Crime Lab partners with cities and communities to use data and research to design and test programs that can enhance public safety. Under Ms. Anders' leadership, the Crime Lab has supported and evaluated violence intervention programs, including Becoming a Man, Choose to Change, and the Ready Initiative. The Crime Lab has also evaluated and supported law enforcement programs, including CPD's Officer Support System, a data-driven early intervention system that flags officers at risk for adverse events. Ms. Anders holds a BA from Boston U and an MS in Health Policy from Harvard. We start with the administration of the oath. I'd ask you to please stand and raise your right hand. Do you affirm the testimony you're about to give for the committee be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, help you God? Let the record indicate that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. And Superintendent Brown, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin and members of the committee.
Is the microphone on and pulled close to you?
Yes, can you hear me
There you
now?
go.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Durbin and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to today's hearing on combating gun trafficking and reducing violence in Chicago. I would like to also start by thanking Senator Durbin for his dedicated leadership here in the city of Chicago and across the state of Illinois. Today's hearing is only one example of your unyielding support for the Chicago Police Department and the selfless men and women who don the uniform throughout the state of Illinois. Whether it's meeting with officers on the beat or meeting with lawmakers on Capitol Hill, we see your advocacy, sir, for law enforcement and commitment to making a change. I also want to thank President Biden for his steadfast support of law enforcement during what is undoubtedly one of the most challenging times to be a police officer in the nation's history. Along with several law enforcement and public safety advocates, I met with President Biden at the White House last summer to discuss ways to strengthen the federal and local partnerships to curtail gun trafficking and the violence it brings to too many communities across this country and, of course, in Chicago. While our partnerships is a healthy partnership, more coordination and resources to make it more significant is needed. I'm sure we could all list many important reasons for being here today, but the fact remains there are none more important than 4-year-old Michael Moultrie or 7-year-old Jacelyn Adams or 71-year-old Hoom Singh C. and CPD's own Officer Ella French, or any of the other precious lives claimed by senseless gun violence. Michael Moultrie was getting his hair cut. Jacelyn Adams was at a fast food restaurant. Mr. C, he was simply walking to get his morning newspaper. And our brave Officer Ella French was fearlessly apprehending a suspect in possession of an illegal gun. In every instance, someone lost a loved one they will always remember, and the city of Chicago lost a neighbor that we must never forget. And the Chicago Police Department lost a brave and courageous officer. Their lives and their legacies are our calls to action. This hearing reminds us of that. A vast majority of gun crimes are committed using illegal firearms. The firearm used to take the life of Officer French was obtained illegally in a straw purchase, underscoring the absolute urgency for smart legislation and strategic prosecution. If convicted, the straw purchaser faces no minimum sentence. We need legislation focused on protecting our communities and our police officers by doing everything possible to keep firearms out of the hands of individuals who should not have them. And collaboration across federal, state, and local governments aimed at violence prevention, because we will not merely just arrest or prosecute our ways to safer communities. Over the course of 2021, 93% of all murders in the city of Chicago were caused by guns. This year, as has been recounted by other testimony this morning, we also are seeing more than 700 people murdered. And remain on pace as well to recover over 12,000 guns this year. That's the most guns recovered in the history of the Chicago Police Department. And every gun recovery is a potential deadly force encounter by our police officers, as well as potentially a life saved. And while burglaries and robberies are at historic lows, we saw a significant uptick in ghost guns, which cannot be traced. In 2020, Chicago police officers recovered 130 ghost guns. So far this year, the latest numbers, we've already recovered more than 430 guns in 2021. Combating gun trafficking and reducing violence requires an evidence-informed, smart solutions from everyone at every level. On the federal level, I'm proud that the Chicago Police Department maintains crucial working relationships with federal partners such as FBI, DEA, and ATF. Earlier this year in July, the Chicago Police Department created its first ever gun investigations team to target and eliminate the illegal pipeline of firearms flowing through Chicagoland. In one of the most successful operations to date, the gun investigations team spearheaded an effort that resulted in 4 individuals being charged federally. The team also recovered 84 firearms as a result of this investigation and several switcher devices, which turned semi-automatic handguns into fully automatic submachine pistols with ammunition and silencers. Chicago's ATF task force officers, also known as TFOs, were instrumental when the investigation crossed state lines into St. Louis, Missouri. Yet, there is no federal law against gun trafficking. Federal sentencing guidelines must reflect the severity of the national gun violence problem. Harsher penalties for straw purchasers and gun traffickers will send a message. The problem of gun violence in Chicago is not a local problem, but a national problem. Local gun violence in a hub for transportation, culture, and commerce undoubtedly impacts national security because gun trafficking is intrinsically cross-jurisdictional. On a local level, the City of Chicago's efforts have included supporting programs for violence prevention and reduction with $52 million in funding through our annual budget. In June of 2020, Mayor Lori Lightfoot launched Our City, Our Safety, a comprehensive approach to reduce violence in Chicago. Our City, Our Safety is a public health approach to community safety that is community-centered, data-driven, and evidence-based. This past summer, the men and women of the Chicago Police Department, my brothers and sisters in blue, worked with every level of local government as well as with residents and community leaders to implement the mayor's summer safety strategy. Using violent crime data over the previous 3 summers, the Chicago Police Department identified 15 police beats, our 15 most violent beats, which had experienced the highest levels of violence. After dividing those beats into 4 safety zones, two on the south side and 2 on the west side, we got to work. We flooded those zones with police and other resources, including both wraparound city and community-based services. This whole of government approach, nearly every city department and sister agency participated, including the mayor's office, Department of Family and Support Services, the Park District, and the Chicago Public Library, to include Chicago Public Schools, city colleges, and the Office of Emergency Management, and more. We targeted resources to specific areas of high need. We used data and input and collaboration from the community to guide and deploy police personnel, ensuring proactive engagement, such as foot patrols and community safety. One of the zones that we focused on had a 75% reduction in homicides. During this time, the city also dedicated $85 million in American Rescue Plan Act and bond funding to bolster violence prevention programming for the next 3 years. As a result, the Community Safety Coordination Center is funding and supporting violence reduction efforts in those 15 priority communities, scaling what we learned over the summer's pilot program, focus on those high violence beats and where they're located. This work that we're doing is bolstered by an almost $400 million investment to support the comprehensive strategies identified in our city, our safety. Continuing this momentum and with the right resources and strategies is vital. In addition to finally take aim at gun trafficking with robust federal laws, I ask that you fund local law enforcement efforts, the allocation of funds for basic investigation and lab equipment, at least 30 additional fully funded ATF task force officers, and additional fully funded FBI, DEA, and Homeland Security investigations task force officers would be invaluable to the levels that LAPD and NYPD have. Chicago falls far short for their TFOs in those federal task forces. We need federal help on the ground for large-scale efforts to take down the criminal networks driving violence. Fully funded 3 TFOs reduce the drain on limited federal resources by splitting the cost with CPD and provide CPD officers the ability to go after interstate gun trafficking offenders. The tracing and testing of guns in Chicago is of national importance since we know these guns crossed state lines. A team of additional assistant U.S. attorneys dedicated to prosecuting criminal networks in the highest crime districts is necessary to follow through on the work done by police. With the right resources, safety won't have to be just a goal. It can be a standard. Thank you again, Senator Durbin, for the opportunity to speak here today, and to all of you for your leadership and attention on this urgent matter. And I look forward to taking your questions.
Thanks, Superintendent. Ms. Swear.
Chairman Durbin, members of the committee, and fellow Americans. My name is Amy Swear, and I'm a legal fellow in the Heritage Foundation's Ed Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. For almost 30 years, this nation experienced a general downward trend in violence, including gun violence, even as the number of privately owned firearms steadily rose. Then,
is that better? Then, very suddenly, in early 2020, not just in Chicago, but across the nation, we experienced an unprecedented surge in homicide and gun violence. The national homicide rate spiked by roughly 30%, the highest single-year increase in the nation's history. We could just as easily be holding this hearing in Philadelphia, or Portland, or Austin, or even back in the Senate building in Washington, D.C. Every single person in this building, in this room, is here today because we recognize that this unparalleled acute spike in violence and death is a very serious problem that we ought to take seriously. We are all invested in that same goal of saving lives. The question is how we understand the cause of this problem. What is driving this spike in homicides and violent crime across the nation? Because it's very clear that something, or most likely some combination of things, happened in 2020 to abruptly reverse that decades-long national trend. There has been an unfortunate tendency to resort to standard politically expedient talking points to blame, for example, surges in lawful gun sales or supposedly lax gun laws in neighboring states. As I explained in length in my written testimony, and as I'm more than happy to comment on in questions, these things are not the driving forces behind this recent nationwide spike. I appreciate Ms. Detinio's explanation in the first panel of interstate gun sales, and I point out that, again, there's no private sale exception for these interstate gun sales. There are, I believe, far better answers to the question of what changed in 2020 that is driving this. In the last 2 years, this nation experienced a global pandemic, saw several periods of widespread civil unrest, had many police departments dramatically alter the deployment of their resources, and witnessed the high-profile proliferation of anti-police sentiment. As I lay out in my submitted written testimony, all of these factors likely played their own roles in creating a national environment ripe for violence. All of this has been exacerbated by a troubling movement of poorly designed bail policies, or designed bail reforms and lenient prosecutorial tactics that routinely jeopardize the public safety. Progressive prosecutors in Chicago and in many other cities across the country, including in otherwise, quote, tough on crime states, are making a mockery of true criminal justice reform. At least when studies refuse to fudge numbers or exclude certain conveniently chosen categories of violent crime, I think the data is very clear that these policies in practice have not properly balanced reform with public safety. Here in Chicago, newly implemented bail policies have resulted in 33% more individuals on pretrial release being charged with committing a new violent crime. And given abysmally low clearance and arrest rates for these crimes, we are almost certainly undercounting that impact. Additional evidence is thoroughly laid out in my written testimony, but frankly, nothing could capture the breadth of this problem better than one recent yet fairly common example that should infuriate every person in this room.
Ms. Swear, I read your testimony, and I believe in all fairness, since we did not invite the Cook County State's Attorney's Office to be represented here today, that you shouldn't really zero in on any particular individual. If you want to speak to the trends, that's certainly you're right, but because that decision was made by the committee to keep this more at the federal level, I hope you'll respect that.
Senator, I do in fact respect that this is something that we are looking at from a federal level. However, when we're talking about what is actually happening in Chicago, I think Mr. Lausch from the first panel is correct. We need to look at how do things like not charging 5 individuals who shot up a residential neighborhood on a weekend on a Friday, who none of which were charged and were released on Monday, how does that impact the feeling of confidence? How does that build trust with communities? I think that is a valid thing to consider because, again, as other panelists have pointed out, a lot of criminal justice, a lot of how we actually enforce the law is done at a local level. These things matter.
I understand that, but what I'm saying to you is there is another side to the story, I believe. I'm not here to defend one or the other, but we didn't invite the elected official that you're referring to and made this decision, and I would think that in fairness, you should proceed with many of the other points that you have in your statement.
Well, I will summarize that with respect and deference to you, Mr. Chairman, by saying that, again, it is one fairly common example that I think points back to this lack of trust and the ways in which some of these prosecutorial tactics facilitate this violence. Because this crime spike is not because more Americans have purchased firearms through lawful channels this year. It's not because Chicago residents can purchase a gun 20 minutes away in Indiana, subject to the same restrictions as if they purchased it 20 minutes away in an Illinois suburb. It's because millions of Americans suddenly lost their livelihoods, or had their livelihoods ripped out from under them, had their vital social networks disrupted, had all manner of serious stressors inflicted on them over an extended period of time. It's because the police departments across this nation had abruptly changed the ways in which they deploy their resources, in which they responded to service calls and interacted with civilians. It's because certain prosecutors can't be bothered to pursue criminal charges, and I think not just in one case, but in many cases where offenders are too often released on bail or prosecutions are refused on their behalf. I think acknowledging the roles that these widespread, drastic policy changes played in creating this climate of violence may not be as simple or politically expedient as blaming lawful gun sales or neighboring states, but it would go a long way to saving lives. So I look forward to your questions, especially with regard to ways in which we can combat the effects of these policy changes.
Ms. Ander?
Good morning, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. The University of Chicago Crime Lab is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research center that designs, tests, and scales data-driven innovations to reduce gun violence and to improve our criminal justice system. We generate evidence about how the public sector can better address these two issues and then design solutions based on that evidence. Thank you for the opportunity to share some of our findings before this esteemed committee. As has been mentioned, gun violence started surging across the United States in 2020. Between 2019 and 2020, there was the largest one-year rise in the homicide rate in 50 years, and that increase, unfortunately, has spilled into 2021. Chicago has been particularly hard hit. The city is on track to end the year with close to 800 homicides, a 3% increase relative to 2020, and a 60% increase relative to 2019. But those numbers don't begin to tell the full story. The data show that there has been a widening safety gap, I might say a safety gulf, in our city between the safest and least safe neighborhoods. In 2020, the homicide rate in Chicago's 4 most dangerous police districts was 25 times higher than in the 4 safest. In 1991, the rate was 13 times higher, meaning that since the 1990s, the gap in basic safety has doubled in Chicago. The brunt of this burden is disproportionately borne by our city's Black neighborhoods. That alone should motivate us to act. Adding to that is the ripple effect of gun violence, which goes far beyond the direct victims and even their immediate families. Just to offer one example, our Crime Lab affiliate, Princeton sociologist Pat Sharkey, has shown that children who take academic assessments in the days following a homicide in their neighborhood looked as if they'd missed 2 years of school. Multiply that day in and day out across our country. What we are doing to our children and to our nation's future should demand urgent and deliberate action. Many are framing what has happened over the last 2 years as a, quote, crime crisis. That is not accurate. In the United States, several types of even violent crime are down, including robbery, rape, and the property crime has continued its years-long decline. We don't have a crime crisis, we have a gun violence crisis. To that end, I'm encouraged that so many components of the Build Back Better bill are backed by data and research that suggests they would help save lives in 2022 and beyond. But first, it's important to understand what gun violence in America actually looks like. There's an idea that most gun violence is rational or pre-planned or carefully thought through. But in fact, a huge share of murders in the United States are not motivated by money or robberies or wars between gangs or crews over drug turf. They're very often the result of an argument that spins out of control. Here in Chicago, fully 3/4 of shootings stem from an altercation that happens to take place within reach of a gun. That means that one way to reduce gun violence is to make those situations in which those arguments occur more forgiving. The best way to do that is to limit the widespread availability of illegal guns. By the Crime Lab's estimate, illegal gun carrying in Chicago increased by over 100% in 2020, likely driven by guns trafficked into Chicago, many from outside of Illinois. Without the presence of a gun, altercations would still happen, but they would be far less likely to result in death. That's why if Chicago, with its existing gun laws, were an island, and the city would not have a gun violence crisis. But weaker laws at the federal level and in many neighboring states mean Chicago and Illinois bear the cost of others' policy choices. Fair and effective policing is also critical to help de-escalate arguments and to deter illegal gun carrying. But policing being, quote, fair and effective is key. Research shows that when the relationship between police and communities erode, the public's willingness to report crimes declines, making people more likely to turn to self-enforcement and retaliation instead of the criminal justice system. Ineffective, overly aggressive policing also causes significant individual harms that are disproportionately borne by communities of color and in particular our Black residents. For too long, policymakers have viewed reducing gun violence and reforming the criminal justice system as inherently in tension. But to truly increase public safety, we must find solutions to do both. Reducing low-level arrests, particularly drug and misdemeanor arrests, while focusing more surgically on disrupting underground gun markets and illegal gun carrying are two complementary efforts. In addition, there are other investments that we can make right now that would also address the situations that lead to gun violence. The Build Back Better bill, currently being debated by Congress, would help finance many of these data-driven and evidence-informed investments. The bill includes $5 billion in funding for community violence intervention programs, or CVI programs, which help people navigate complex and often high-stakes situations that could lead to violence before they do, and interrupt the cycles of violence once they start. At the Crime Lab, we've conducted randomized control trials, the gold standard in medicine, of several CVI-related programs that show enormous promise. Two of these are the Choose to Change program and Becoming a Man, both of which connect young people at elevated risk of gun violence involvement with trauma and behavioral science-informed services and supports. Crime Lab researchers found that participation in BAM can cut violent crime arrests among youth in half and boost the high school graduation rates of participants by nearly 20%. Preliminary research of Choose to Change shows a similar impact on participants' violent crime involvement, and the impacts persist far after the intervention itself ends, a finding that is truly remarkable and still all too rare in social science. Another CVI program, Ready Chicago, reaches the men truly at highest risk of gun violence involvement. 35% of the Ready participants have previously been shot. 98% have been arrested at least once, with an average of 17 prior arrests, and I would argue missed opportunities to do something different to offer other ways to intervene. These are men for whom our society provides absolutely no safety net. Ready is changing that. While preliminary, our research shows that men who participated in Ready have far fewer arrests for shootings and for homicides. Build Back Better also incentivizes state and local zoning reforms and expands programs like housing choice vouchers and community development block grants. These investments would help desegregate communities, repair vacant lots, and expand street lighting, all of which a growing body of research shows can reduce gun violence. In short, there are things we can do and places where federal resources can have a particularly vital impact. The data shows that by making situations more forgiving, which complements our efforts to improve policing, can help stem the tide of gun violence. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Zander. Superintendent Brown, how many police do we have in the city of Chicago?
Right at 11,000. Sorry, right at 11,000, sir.
And annually, with retirements and other decisions, how many do you have to recruit to make up for vacancies?
So we have an annual attrition rate of about 5%. So we'd have to recruit that 5% number. And we're behind because of COVID's impact on our ability to test in a room and scale. We had an outbreak of COVID in our police academy last summer. Summer before last summer of 2020, so we had to shut down our academy due to a COVID outbreak. So we're a little bit behind the curve, but we have a plan to catch up. We have a recruiting team on the ground, but we do have the impacts of COVID and attrition on our department at this point.
So how far behind are we in terms of recruiting to replenish the ranks to what they ordinarily reach?
We currently have about 7,000 applicants to be a police officer in Chicago. We need another 7,000 applicants, so we're about halfway where we need to be. As far as vacancies, we're nearly 1,000 vacancies, so we need to really recruit. By the way, just a shameless plug for whoever's listening, our salaries are at $80,000 after your training in 18 months, and we have fully funded tuition reimbursement.
You've explained this on the basis of COVID. Is there anything to do with morale that is affecting the number who are applying to become Chicago policemen?
Yes, there is. So without question, the impacts of the vacillations of the political discussion between abolish the police, defund the police, and the criticism of police have done damage to the psyche of police officers, people willing to do this job. Every department in this country is struggling to recruit young people who are not coming into this profession like they have in the past. So we have to be more aggressive in our lifting up our police and really encouraging them that the public supports their efforts and their sacrifice much more than we have.
And could you indicate for us, please, is it more dangerous this day to be a policeman in Chicago than it was last year, let's say?
So last year we had a 500% increase in the number of officers shot at or shot. 500 last year, and we are surpassing last year's number so far this year. It is, without question, not only the most challenging time to be a cop, but the most dangerous time to be a cop.
And could you explain that? There are various theories you've heard. The witness sitting next to you has her theory. What is your theory about why it is more dangerous?
I think there's various issues. I wouldn't point to one thing. Similar to the rise in violence, I think there's some concern about trauma, the impacts of trauma in communities. But clearly, part of the formula for why the brazenness that offenders have is we need more consequences as well. We need some of our people, not going back to the mass incarceration era. No one wants to go back to that, but there are some violent people that need to be held in jail till trial. They're dangerous to the community, and they need to be held in jail. That discussion doesn't mean I support or anyone supports mass incarceration. That's just protecting us all. The people who would harm us need to be held when they're charged, when they're stopped constitutionally, when they're in possession of an illegal firearm. They need to be seeing real consequences in the criminal justice system.
I assume you were in the room. If not, I mentioned earlier that my wife and I went to Rita High School for the memorial service for Ella French. It was an outpouring of support from the law enforcement community, the likes of which I've never seen. People were standing blocks long in queue, waiting for a chance to pass by and pay their respects. Can you describe the impact that killing had on the Chicago Police Department?
It's just tragic and resonated throughout. Young cops, very veteran cops, all wept. And we continue to grieve. That was just in August. We continue to grieve her loss. But what is also infuriating is that straw purchaser that bought the gun and gave it to the offender who used it on Ella, causing her death, walked in and out of federal court because it was basically an administrative violation to buy a gun. There was no real serious consequence for a straw purchase of a gun used to kill a police officer. It's the only untoward word I've had to John Losh, which I know is not his issue, but the fact that this person walked in and out of federal court as a straw purchaser that caused the death of a police officer should make us all sear with anger. And the pain throughout our police department continues to resonate.
And I might add, I think we should, the other officer was gravely wounded. He survived, I believe, but
he survived, yes.
He had some serious permanent injuries as a result of that shooting.
Yeah, Officer Yanez is just Carlos is a walking miracle that he's able to walk and stand on his own. And we were with him this past weekend, delivering gifts to him and his family. It's a miracle that he survived. This offender not only shot and killed Ella, but also seriously wounded Carlos Yanez and tried to kill a third officer who was on the scene. And thank goodness we were able to capture this offender and bring him to justice.
And you make the point, I mean, it affected my wife and myself personally just to see the outpouring of emotion for Ella French, that this straw purchase is considered to be a bookkeeping offense at this point. When someone who legally can purchase a gun because they have no criminal record are doing so to hand it over to someone who cannot legally purchase a gun. That is more than a loophole. That is a just tragic situation that there's no explanation for. And I believe that that drives it home more than anything I could possibly say. I have legislation to change that. I want to make it a serious offense. But I also have to tell you, I think that the licensed gun dealers have a responsibility too. They know better.
That's right.
They have to know better when someone is purchasing a gun or a volume purchase of guns, that this just isn't for their personal use. There's something else going on here, and we've got to open our eyes to it in this situation. On the morale side of it, let me say as well, I can't recall exactly when it occurred, but I asked for a meeting with some members of the Chicago Police Department, and I met with two groups. And the first, and this was how long ago, maybe one of my staff remembers, I went down to the training academy, and they just put up a notice that said, there's a politician who's going to have an off-the-record meeting. If you want to come by and tell him what you think, drop by. Well, they sure did. There probably were 15 or 16 in the room, black, white, and brown, men and women. Some were 3 years veterans, and some were 20-year veterans in the police department. And we talked about everything imaginable that affected them, at least in the federal debate that was going on at the time. And of course, they had their own point of view on some things. The media reporting they didn't think was always complete and accurate. And they felt that not enough information was given to the public before they drew conclusions about what happened in a given circumstance. The split-second decision which some police were making was somehow elongated in the press version to look like it was a much different experience. But, you know, you must run into that yourself when you're talking to members of the force.
Yes, sir. And it's no doubt in my mind, Senator, you make the right points here, that there is a silent majority of this country that supports our officers, but our officers only hear the loud minority of people who hyper-criticize and really come across as not supporting or even understanding that they're sacrificing their lives for our safety in this country, that they're doing all they can to push back against violent people that would harm them. To the point of making the ultimate sacrifice like Ella French did. And so, you know, I would just echo your sentiments, but I would also ask the silent majority to speak up more in their support of our police officers, to keep them encouraged so that our morale can be boosted.
I want to add, too, that this is important. I think there is an appropriate role for social workers and psychological counselors. There are many times that police are drawn into domestic violence situations which are not really, shouldn't be law enforcement confrontations, but rather there's a need for some psychology and mediation and conversation. And I think those resource people could supplement and even replace many times what the police are doing in their line of duty. But I want to add something that the mayor shared with me a couple of weeks ago when she came to Washington. Many of these social workers and psychological counselors are making the point to her that they're willing to do this, but they want a policeman accompanying them for obvious reasons. Right. They're risking their lives when they go into some of these volatile situations. Could you comment on that?
Yes, there's no doubt. I've been on the record in my career saying we're asking our police officers to do too much in our society, and we need others to step forward, like mental health professionals and other social workers. I fully support those co-responder models where subject matter experts in other professions like psychology, psychiatry, and other social work respond with our officers. And there may be an occasion where we can triage at the 911 centers these calls to where we can more do follow-up. Some may be about someone taking their medication that obviously doesn't have access to quality mental health care. So again, support the sentiment of others in the social service work coming forward, helping our police officers, and the fact that we're asking our police officers to do more and more and more in society that we just are not equipped to do.
Would you comment on concealed carry and open carry in the state of Illinois? Do you think that the provisions in the state law are overly strict prohibitions on the public?
So every situation that involves conflict, when you add a gun, it's more dangerous. I'm a big proponent in the fact that guns make us less safe, not more safe. I'm totally against this idea of a good guy with a gun from a law enforcement perspective, because we can't discern who the good guy with a gun is, nor have I seen a good guy with a gun make a situation safer. Lacking that evidence, I don't know how any of us support this idea of more guns in society.
And also this concept of vigilantism, that volunteers will step in the situation and try to assume the responsibilities of police. The point that you just made, how is the policeman going to know whether that person carrying an AR-47 or what happens to be, whatever the firearm happens to be, how are they to know whether that person is truly, quote, on their side in a life and death split-second decision-making situation?
You won't know, sir, and it will just make the situation less safe. Officers having to make even more split-second decisions about who is this person with the gun, open carry, concealed carry, taking action in a role that they haven't been trained at, nor have we considered all of their biases. You know, this action of vigilantism in Black and brown communities, in my mind, having grown up in a Black community, born and raised in a high violent area, having a vigilante taking action, it just makes it seem like more chaotic, less safe for all of us.
And you allude to this, and I'd like you to say a few more words if you would. The lack of trust between many members of the Black community and the men and women in blue is part of the problem in getting to the solution part, closing the case, taking the people off the street. Have you seen anything that you could point to that is a change in this or a breakthrough?
Yes, so we have seen progress, although we have much more to do in building trust. This year, the Chicago Police Department is solving more homicides than they have in over 16 years. We've solved over 360 homicides this year, mostly due to that trust with the community coming forward. One example is Mr. C, who I recounted in my opening comments, was walking, he was shot and killed. The Asian Chamber of Commerce came forward with a license plate number with video within minutes to our officers, to our detectives, allowing us to capture that offender within an hour and charge him with first-degree murder. Without the community, that would not have happened. So we're seeing progress in building trust, more community members coming forward. There's much more work that needs to be done in building trust, though.
Ms. Ander, there's been a question raised about the bail reform in the state of Illinois, and those of us who have considered this understand that sometimes people are pulled over for a driving offense. They're violating some court order that said that they were not supposed to, until they paid a certain fine, drive again legally, and they're caught in the process of doing that and incarcerated, and a bail is imposed that they can't pay. They are literally in a debtor's prison situation and sometimes jeopardize their job. Have you had an experience with this?
The point that you raise, I think, really is illustrative of the fact that we are missing an opportunity, as I said in my testimony, to both reduce the harms of the criminal justice system, which is the aspiration of bail reform. How do we take the things that create all kinds of unintended harms that are really not providing a public safety benefit, and move away from using those levers so that we can much more focus the back end of the system, the criminal justice system, on the things that are doing the greatest harm, and that really is gun violence. And so I think what has been lost in a lot of the, at least the public discourse about bail reform in this country and in this county, is this notion that it's either we can dramatically reduce the number of people that are sitting in jails pre-trial, but that comes at the expense of increasing gun violence, and that's a false choice. But I would say to do both of those things together does require being data-driven and evidence-informed. And I think that we really have much more that could be done, and I think all parts of the system need to be a part of that working together effort so that we can make sure that when we are depriving someone of their liberty, which is should be an incredibly high bar, that there really is a public safety threat that's been understood, so that we're not, as you said, creating a debtor's prison and frankly net widening and pulling people deeper and deeper into the criminal justice system that provides no public safety benefit.
You mentioned Ready Chicago. I visited some of their facilities, and I've also met with Eddie Bocanegra, whom we all know, an amazing life story, who is proving every single day that many of these souls can be saved if we care and if we approach it the right way. So I hope this violence intervention funding that we're looking at in the reconciliation bill can help along those lines. Thanks to the Crime Lab, you do terrific work. Ms. Swear, during a July 2020 appearance on One American News, The Tipping Point, you said that is, quote, absolutely false, unquote, that Chicago's gun violence problem is a result of the city being inundated with out-of-state guns. You argued that claim is based on a misrepresentation of Chicago's 2017 gun trace report. But that report does in fact show that 60% of the guns recovered in Chicago crimes originated from out of state. Do you want to clear up what you said in that newscast?
Sure. I would absolutely love to give further context to this because this is important. As other panelists have noted, the reality is that it doesn't matter where individuals, where residents in Illinois are buying their firearms, whether it's in Illinois or across state lines, they are going to be subject to those same background checks or subject to the same laws and requirements that they would be in Illinois. Nothing has changed regardless of whether they're buying it in an Illinois suburb. They're not buying it in the city of Chicago because, as others have noted, there are no gun stores in the city of Chicago. So the fact that the general proximity of many of these gun stores in Indiana, the fact that there is no Cook County imposed extra tax on those guns is very clear that, yeah, there are going to be people who are going to either lawfully or unlawfully buy guns across the border in Indiana. That has nothing to do with Indiana's gun laws. They are simply violating the same types of laws they would be had they illegally purchased the guns from a private seller or stolen them in Illinois. The point is that whether it's across the border or in Indiana, that's not having an effect on crime itself in Chicago.
Superintendent Brown, how would you respond to that claim that out-of-state guns are not a driving force in Chicago violence?
So I would just say this, people who have violent criminal backgrounds who are in possession of illegally possessed guns, regardless of where they buy them from, and the data speaks for itself, is the driver of violence in Chicago. It is without question. Offenders we charge with murder, first degree or otherwise, have a gun illegally, and most, if not all, have a previous violent criminal history. That's just the basic facts. And I always, senators say this, you know, everyone's entitled to their opinion, but not their own facts.
In April, the city of Chicago filed suit against West Fourth Sports, a northern Indiana gun shop, alleging the shop knowingly sold firearms to gun traffickers who in turn sold them to people who were prohibited from purchasing them themselves. That one gun shop was a source of over 850 crime guns recovered in Chicago between 2009 and 2016. I would think in situations like these that cracking down on gun trafficking and the license dealers that encourage it is critical, whether they're in Indiana or any other place. And certainly we've been able to trace many of these guns back to Indiana. I'm hoping that Mr. Lausch can get a cooperative bi-state, multi-state effort, regional effort to bring a close to this. Those are all the questions that I have for this panel, and I thank you for your testimony. This field hearing of the Senate Judiciary Committee has made it clear that we have work to do. Senator Patrick Leahy has a statement he'd like to enter into the record, and that'll be done without any objection. I'm going to do all I can as a senator from this state and chair of the committee to address this challenge. As I mentioned, this is our 5th hearing on gun violence. We'll keep at it next year. I will not stop pushing to bring Chicago the federal resources and attention it needs to encourage collaboration and to support law enforcement. And I want to say, it's been recommended to me, and I think it's good practice, that those of us who appreciate the men and women in uniform who get up every morning, put on the badge that you're wearing, and risk their lives for us, deserve our gratitude. And I'm going to make a point of saying so when I see them. We want the very best in the job. We're not making excuses for those who aren't, but the vast majority of those women and men are dedicated to protecting the public for the right reasons. I'm going to continue to push federal agencies to do all they can and more. Going to keep working with the stakeholders in this state and in Washington. I thank our witnesses for attending today, and I thank my colleagues. A number of them stayed on for the entire hearing. That was showed